Cuba is next. That's what President Trump said, and then cracked a joke. He said, pretend I didn't say that. You're going to hear those words. He dropped the line, smiled, and every Havana apologist from Barack Obama's old network to Mark Pocan started sweating. Because Rubio is already stacking the file. And wait to hear what that report ties back to in 1995. See, we're talking July 23rd, sanctions hit 11 Cuban-linked targets as 3 Spanish hotel chains bailed. That is not symbolic at all. Melia, Iberostar, Barcelo are getting out after the Trump administration hammered Cuba's tourism ministry. And you can feel the squeeze already. And now stack that with Rubio's State Department branding Cuba the capital of 21st century communism, and warning that Havana hosted Chinese and Russian intelligence activity 90 miles from our shore. You see it, right? Trump is pressuring a communist outpost in our backyard, while Democrats like Mark Pocan still peddle Obama's fairy tale that nothing bad happened. See, Marco Rubio just named a communist pipeline into American institutions. And big insurance, they run the same scam on seniors through a Medicare confusion industrial complex. Chapter cuts right through it. You see, they're simple by design. With one simple call, you get matched with an advisor who advocates for you and not big insurance. No Havana-style disinformation. No insurance company maze. Chapter looks at your doctors. They look at your prescriptions. They do a whole situational review and lay out your best plan options with no propaganda, just simple facts. And that's how you beat the confusion machine. If your current Medicare plan is right, they will tell you. If not, they can help you switch. The average caller saves $1,100. You see, it's free and it takes just about 20 minutes. So call Chapter at the number on the screen, 910-728-4109. Bureaucrats thrive on confusion and patriots don't. So Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers, they launched Obama's 1995 campaign in their living room. We're going to stop right there on that because Rubio didn't just torch Havana overseas. He traced the pipeline straight into the American left's bloodstream and even the Democrat Party itself. So when we pull up these posts, watch who panics first. President Trump has been saying this for months now. Cuba is next.
But I was watching this and I'm hearing them saying, could he be losing the MAGA base? I don't think so. You know why? Because MAGA wants to win, number one. Number two, they want our country protected. They don't want another country out there that's hostile and crazy to have a nuclear weapon. And number three, they like us protecting certain allies, whether it's Israel or Saudi Arabia or Qatar or UAE, any of them. They want that. MAGA wants strength and they want victory. They want success. And that's what we have. And we have been very, very successful. You know, when I went into Venezuela, I said, because I campaigned on the fact peace through strength, you wouldn't have to use it. I said, you'll never have to use it. But sometimes use it. And Cuba's next, by the way. But pretend I didn't say that, please. Pretend I didn't say that. Please, 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 media, please. Disregard that statement. Thank you very much. Cuba's next.
Cuba's next, guys. So Trump tossing out the line about Cuba. Now Marco Rubio's backing the warning of the report that says Havana spent decades planting spies, backing bombers, and targeting America from the inside. Marco Rubio just put out a new report on Cuba, and holy crap, says MJ Truth Ultra. They're a great follow on X. Cuba's invisible invasion, 70 years of spies, bombs, and the quiet war to turn America against itself. For nearly 7 decades, communist Cuba has run a sophisticated, low-profile campaign of espionage, terrorism support, and ideological subversion aimed at the United States. This is the platform, this is the bedrock that they are going to use. This is the pretext for the invasion of Cuba. The document portrays Havana not as a distant failed state, but as the operational heart of a long war designed to weaken America from the inside right next door. Spies in the highest corridors of power, Cuban agents, allegedly penetrated the State Department, National Security Council, and Pentagon at the deepest levels, some operating undetected for decades. One agent rose to senior National Security Council roles and even became a U.S. ambassador while secretly working for Havana for roughly 50 years. Victor Manuel Roca. He was recruited by Cuban intelligence in 1973 while living in Chile. Over the following decade, he rose through the U.S. foreign policy ranks, serving as Director of Inter-American Affairs on the National Security Council, and later as U.S. Ambassador to Bolivia. He worked for Havana for roughly 50 years. Another was Defense Intelligence Agency top Cuba expert named Ana Belén Montes, feeding secrets, including the identities of undercover officers back to the island. A third State Department official named Walter Kendall Myers spied for nearly 30 years and personally met Fidel Castro. The report suggests that these high-profile cases are only the visible tip of a much larger network. Also fueling violence on American streets, Havana is directly named in the report for recruiting, training, and backing radical groups that carried out waves of attack inside the United States. The report connects Cuban support to organizations behind roughly 2,500 bombings on U.S. soil in just 2 years during the early 1970s. Because Cuba could never match American military power head-on, it perfected a different approach using proxies, safe havens for fugitives, and sabotage to wage a war of attrition. Turning Americans against their own country, from the early 60s onward, Cuba built a systematic pipeline to recruit and radicalize Americans. It funded early U.S. support groups, hosted thousands of young activists on the island through organized brigades, and staged major international conferences that spread a new brand of revolutionary ideology focused on racial and social grievance. Isn't that what we're seeing right now, guys? All over the campuses in America? The report claims this infrastructure helped shape generations of activists, influenced politicians, and universities, and left lasting fingerprints on later movements and campus unrest, just like I said. Post-Soviet Command Center. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba's version of communism, less about classic class struggle and more about third worldism and identity-based revolt, survived and expanded. The island is described as an ongoing intelligence and influence operation whose real focus remains to disrupt the United States. It currently hosts significant Chinese and Russian listening posts. We've covered that extensively here on Next News. They're capable of monitoring the southeastern U.S. while continuing to serve as a hub for radical networks across the hemisphere. Taken as a whole, the report presents Cuba as the quiet architect of a multi-generational sting. It spies in Washington, bombs in American cities, activists on campuses, and an ideology designed to turn the United States against itself, all directed from just 90 miles away. And Rubio just busted it wide open. The report is huge, and you should take the time to read it at the statedepartment.gov. Cuba, the capital of 21st century communism, just released. So it lays out the allegation. Next, the State Department puts it on the record and says Cuba is still hosting Chinese and Russian intel operations 90 miles from our shore. They just put this out today. Cuba, the capital of the 21st century, and this is the video that they attached to it.
A stunning new report out from the State Department. It details a decades-long Cuban influence campaign right here in the U.S.
So the State Department report is titled Cuba, the capital of 21st century communism.
The State Department, today they published a bombshell report.
Virtually every left-wing, radical, violent terrorist group in the Western Hemisphere has at some point relied on support from Cuba. And we have 90 miles from our shores a failed state that also happens to be friendly territory for some of our adversaries. Cuba continues to host a pretty substantial collection of intelligence sites on behalf of the Chinese and the Russians. We've had successive American presidents say that the Western Hemisphere is going to be a priority, and they never do it. And the president has made it a personal priority.
I've known a lot about this, but the fact that it's inside this official report from Secretary of State Marco Rubio is really important.
That is the message from the State Department just issued. So it's not just social media chatter anymore. Next, Rubio turns from the threat file to the pressure campaign, making clear he wants Cuba free and the regime squeezed hard. He says, we want Cuba to be freed. Here is Rubio at the ASEAN Ministerial where he is right now.
Power with.
So you want me to give you details on our plan?
Yeah, just.
Okay, not today. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell you this. No, here's what I told you, and this is the truth. The people who are in charge of the country don't know what they're doing. They don't know. They don't know how to fix their economy. They don't know how, they don't understand basic concepts. And I think the challenge that Cuba has faced for the last 15 years is they want to somewhat improve their economy, but they're afraid that if they improve it too much, they'll lose political control over people. That's the challenge that they face. So I think for us, we're looking for an opportunity to influence the direction that that goes, because it's 90 miles from our shores, and we want Cuba to be prosperous. We want Cuba to be free. But in that sense, you know, on the level of detail you're asking me, suffice it to say that as long as the people that are in charge think the way these people think and act the way these people act, it's going to be difficult for them to make the changes that need to be made in order for Cuba to have a better future. Because they just really, they don't understand it. Some of them are incompetent, and some of them just basically don't understand, and others are just so recalcitrant that they'd rather, you know, destroy the country than ever walk away from a failed ideology, although I think the number of people in that category is less than it's ever been. But for the most part, it's just people that don't know what an economy is supposed to look like. They really don't. And because they've always relied on foreign sponsors. That regime has survived on subsidies from the Soviet Union and then from Chavez. This is the first time they don't have a sponsor that's giving them subsidies for free. And they don't know what to do with themselves, because all they've done is freeload off these countries for all these years. The people of Cuba deserve better than that.
Marco Rubio, laying the groundwork for the invasion of Cuba, says they're broke, incompetent, and running out of sponsors. The White House follows with a blunt warning. Communist rule has pushed Cuba to the edge of failed state status. Here is Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt in the briefing room earlier.
Cuba right now is a country that is about to be a failed state because of the communist policies of the past several decades. Communism should never be allowed to lead this country, and the president obviously is strictly opposed to it and all the dangers.
So the administration says Havana's own communist policies caused the collapse, and Democrats jump in to run cover. Mark Pocan claiming Obama's Cuba opening worked just fine, and Rubio is inventing a pretext. Representative Mark Pocan. It's worth remembering that under the Obama administration, the U.S. restored diplomatic relations with Cuba and nothing bad happened. We should not impose a blockade that has fueled a humanitarian crisis for political reasons rather than genuine national security concerns. Here he is on the safe space known as, it was MSNBC. Now they've rebranded because they're such a failed network, MS Now.
This isn't that there's a national security threat to the United States in any way. In fact, when we opened up during the Obama administration, we had good relations between the countries and nothing bad happened. And then we went back to this very repressive era of 6.5 decades of a blockade. And the only people we're hurting at the end of the day are the Cuban people. So if we think we're trying to help the Cuban people or have a different government as some want here in Washington, we're doing the exact opposite. It's the definition of insanity.
Do you think that Secretary Rubio is trying to lay the groundwork, create a pretext for something?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that this is about trying to do an invasion in some way of Cuba. Since what we saw happen in Venezuela, Marco Rubio kept making it connected to Cuba. This report, which is, again, so ridiculous in what they're saying, how this poor nation that has power blackouts pretty consistently now because of our blockade, can't get medicine and medical parts, can't do almost anything because of the U.S., because of our blockade, and we forced others to do this. To say that somehow they're responsible for anything happening, much less Black Lives Matter or ICE protests like it says, is ridiculous. This is about Marco Rubio just trying to do the politics of South Florida.
So he wants viewers to believe the problem is American pressure, not the regime. But next, Mike Benz revives an Obama-era USAID operation inside Cuba that looks a lot more covert than the left likes to admit. He says one of the most controversial programs during the Obama era wasn't traditional foreign aid. It was covert influence operation inside Cuba. Speaking on Joe Rogan, he details the Zunio project, a USAID-backed social media platform designed to resemble a Cuban version of Twitter. According to Benz, the platform first attracted users with sports, music, and weather before introducing political messaging, using audience data for micro-targeting and encouraging anti-government activism once it reached critical mass. We'll play just some of this here.
This was a scandal during the Obama USAID era. Now, we were running a number of rogue USAID operations in Cuba at the time. By the way, I have to say for the record, I'm no fan of the Cuban government. I'm not even weighing in on whether it's the right or wrong thing to do, in terms of regime change there or, liberating people there from autocratic excess by that government. I'm simply showing the American people where your tax dollars are going and how these things are structured in order to systematically fool you and to fool Congress and to fool the White House. So, for example, this is, and I'll show a couple other things in a second here. But this is Zunzanillo. So if you just scroll for a second, we'll start with this, right? So it was an online social media. Just scroll up 1 second. We'll start at the top here. It was an online social networking microblogging service created by USAID and marketed to Cuban users. Wow. This was a Twitter knockoff. See, the background of this is 2009, 2014, that period. The State Department and USAID were gangbusters gung-ho on the promise of Arab Spring-style social media revolutions to topple other governments. The Arab Spring was a Facebook revolution and a Twitter revolution. USAID pumped $1.2 billion in, and we sponsored these activist groups and these civil society organizations to learn how to use Facebook, learn how to use Twitter, learn how to use hashtags, learn how to coordinate street protests so that everyone knows where to go, what street to show up on, what kind of slogans to use in order to create the pro-democracy, predicate for it. But the problem was at the time, Cuba did not allow U.S. social media in. So they said, so they're not allowing Twitter in. How can we get a Twitter there, but without calling it Twitter, without making it look like it's coming from the U.S.? So what they did is they took the exact same thing as Twitter. Same user interface, same like and retweet button. Zunzanillo is the Cuban slang word for hummingbird. So it means it's bird. It was the Twitter bird, the whole thing. But the whole trick about it was you have to make it look like it's coming from the Cubans if you're going to do this operation. So what you'll see is it began running. So this is 2010. This is right during the Arab Spring. And what you'll see is they took funds, millions of dollars of funds that were concealed as humanitarian funds designated for Pakistan. Now, I don't know if Joe or the audience, if you've looked at a map lately, but Pakistan is not exactly the next door neighbor of Cuba, right? So, and this is the Wikipedia whitewashing, and we can get into the deeper layers of this, but contractors funded by USAID, I should note the main contractor was Creative Associates International, who's a frequent one. It's CAI, not CIA, I promise. So they concealed in the budget from Senate, from Congress, from the White House National Security Council. They said that these were humanitarian funds for Pakistan. And then they ran that to their contractor, CAI, to, quote, set up a Byzantine system of front companies using Cayman Islands bank accounts and recruiting unsuspecting business executives who would not be told of the company's ties to the U.S. government, according to the AP. The private companies like Creative Associates International designed the network. The idea arose after they were given 500,000 stolen Cuban cell phones that were available on the black market. And then what you'll see if you scroll down is... Okay, the network, dubbed the Cuban Twitter, reached about 60,000 Cuban subscribers. The initiative appears to also have had a surveillance dimension, allowing a, quote, vast database of Cuban Zunzanillo subscribers, including gender, age, and receptiveness and political tendencies to be built, with the Associated Press noting such data could be used in the future for political purposes. By the way, these are all quotes from the internal documents, and we can go through that. The data would then be used for micro-targeting efforts towards anti- and pro-government users in Cuba. The developers aimed to, at first, use non-controversial content, such as sports and music, and hurricane updates, by the way. They used hurricane updates in the internal things. Basically a humanitarian front that if you sign up to this app, you'll know about natural disasters in the area. Meanwhile, what was the plan the whole time? Once they built up enough subscribers, they would begin to introduce political messages through social bots and encourage dissent in this astroturfing There's a great Guardian write-up on this. If you go to Guardian Zunzaneo, so you can see how crazy. Just type in Zunzaneo Smart Mob Guardian. You'll see the internal files explicitly said we're going to lure them in with music, sports, and hurricane updates. You have to join. Twitter in Cuba if you want, to be relevant in the culture and see what's trending in sports and music. If you want to be safe in your homes, if you want to know where hurricanes are going, Twitter, Cuban Twitter is the fastest place to get this. It's humanitarian work for, we're saving lives by doing this. But the whole point is once they hit a critical mass, they would create rental riots. And they would use this the same way they used it in Egypt and Tunisia to topple those governments under the Obama administration. They would organize smart mobs, rental riots. And if you scroll down, there's some, this is a fantastic article
there. So that Obama-era program raises a bigger question about who was really playing games around Cuba. Next, the focus shifts to Marco Rubio's report tying Cuban-backed radicals to circles that launched Barack Obama. Barack Obama launched his first political campaign in 1995 in the living room of Weather Underground co-founders Bernardine, Dohrn, and Ayers. That's according to a 100-page report just released by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. The radical left terrorist group carried out bombings on the Pentagon, the U.S. Capitol, and other government buildings. Cuban intelligence provided them covert operational support. Obama maintained social and political ties with them for years in Chicago's leftist circles. Those same ties later influenced his Cuba policy, including the release of the Cuban Five. Cuba trained American radicals, gave sanctuary to fugitives, wanted for bombings and murders, and worked for decades to infiltrate and undermine the United States from within. Rubio's report confirms what declassified intelligence and court records have shown for years. So it looks like it was ultimately Obama who was behind the entire plot to undermine Donald Trump's presidency. Forget the Russians. He is the real enemy. So from the Weather Underground names to Obama's early orbit, the report goes straight at the left's old guard. Next, another breakdown argues Rubio's connecting Cuba's influence machine to the mainstreaming of Marxist policies. Rubio putting out the report that ties the launch of Obama, the mainstreaming of Marxist politics, to that propagated by the Cuban regime, highlighting how he was recruited by the founders of domestic terror group Weather Underground, which aimed to overthrow the U.S. government. So Obama is explicitly named in the Rubio report. So if Cuba's reach really extended into activist pipelines here at home, the next piece shows why people are watching protest networks closely. It spotlights a rapid response plan aimed at military sites, ICE offices, and federal buildings if Washington moves on Cuba. Cuba sleeper agents, poised to wage war in California, put U.S. on high alert as map of their top targets emerges. The plan outlines coordinated nationwide actions within 24 hours if there is an imminent threat or U.S. military move against Cuba. The National Network on Cuba, which created the Rapid Response Plan, brings together over 50 groups, including Democrat Socialists of America, Communist Party USA, and Code Pink. Organizers will focus on military bases, recruitment offices, federal buildings, ICE facilities, and even sports arenas during big events, according to the documents. And this is what the New York Post is putting out. So that cranks up the threat all the way. Up next, Fact Check pushes back hard, saying the document is public protest. Grok says the NNOC, the National Rapid Response Plan, is public activist coordination for protests within 24 hours of U.S. military move on Cuba. We know what that's code for. It's all peaceful, mostly peaceful protests, right? It's always mostly peaceful until they start firebombing buildings. So the examples given for locations: Portland, Orlando, Boston. In California, that would mean spots with those facilities: San Diego Naval Base, Los Angeles, San Diego ICE offices, and federal buildings. It's protest planning, that's what Grok says. But Grok doesn't have the full context, apparently. Next we go from protest claims to real economic pain as Spanish hotel chains start pulling out after Trump's new sanctions. 3 Spanish hotel chains announced they will be ceasing operations in Cuba after Trump's sanctioning Cuba's tourism ministry. So the hotel exits show that sanctions are hitting where it hurts. And then Bannon warns Rubio and the foreign policy crowd are teeing up an information campaign for something much bigger.
imperial state and the way that the corporations want the military and the deep state to be the cop everywhere. Even Rubio had to say it. One of the biggest neocons out there had to say it. You know, distracted him for a second for the invasion of Cuba, because now you see they're teeing up Cuba. Cuba's the font of communism, and Cuba's the font of all this and that. This is how they prep the information war battlefield. We could be everywhere. In fact, we are everywhere. I think we're in 127 countries. You can be spread all over hell's half acre with what are security concerns. You got to prioritize. This is how you stop yourself from having a $2 trillion defense budget paid for by the American taxpayers and not any of these deadbeats around the world, including the biggest deadbeats, which are the Gulf Emirates right now. They're total free riding on the United States of America and the kids of the United States of America. How many...
So Bannon says this is how the intervention argument gets sold. Meanwhile, next, the unrest on the ground in Cuba. Reports of protesters shouting for freedom and tearing at regime propaganda. So that is a massive protest in San Diego de la Vegas. Protesters attempted to tear down regime propaganda posters while shouting freedom and down with the Castros. It's also reported that the people gathered around. So after the street scenes, the next clip asks who actually runs Havana. A dissident voice says Washington wasn't dealing with a figurehead at all with Raul Castro's family and Powder Center. Brussels signaled Cuba's president denied any knowledge of U.S. talks, but the bigger question remains, who was Washington actually negotiating with?
The United States announced that they had a dialogue underway with the Cuban government, and the head of the Cuban government, nominally, his name is Miguel Díaz-Canel, and he was saying that he didn't know anything about a dialogue. So the assumption was he was either lying or there was something else going on. And what we see is that the person the U.S. government was talking to was Raul Castro's grandson, Raulito. And Miguel either was lying or just didn't know because he's not that important. And a few weeks later, he came out in a national address to say, yes, in fact, the United States was in dialogue with Cuba, but in the room sitting there in a very prominent location was Raulito Castro. So we see who the person is behind the throne.
So the interview points to the regime. Behind the regime, next, the predictable far-left response. Communist Party USA says Rubio's report is bogus, claims MAGA is using Cuba as an excuse to crush the left. Communist Party USA on X. Why are more and more young people in the U.S. looking left for answers? A new report from the U.S. State Department blames an old scapegoat, foreign communist subversion. They write, this time around, the Cuban government stands accused of masterminding the entire anti-war, anti-racist, anti-capitalist left in the U.S. They say the allegations are ridiculous, but the goal is no joke, military action against Cuba and violent suppression of the left and people's movements here at home. And that's, I mean, look, I believe that to be true. I believe that what we are seeing is the groundwork being laid for the invasion of Cuba, like it or not. But we definitely do need to crush the radical left here in the United States. Join us Friday for discussion. Communist Party USA on YouTube. So the communists are calling it propaganda, which tells you Rubio hit a nerve next. Havana's own foreign minister lashes out, accusing the U.S. of collective punishment and denying Cuba any threat at all. He says every act of aggression by the U.S. government, such as the measures announced on July 23rd by the Secretary of State, demonstrates that the goal is to impose collective punishment on the entire Cuban people, despite the fact the U.S. government continues to deny. Well, it's not about punishing the Cuban people. They're crying victim, but the final move is action, as Washington drops fresh sanctions on Cuban entities and officials over security threats, sanctions evasion, and forced labor. U.S. imposing fresh sanctions on Cuba. This is just happened today, over security threats. Washington targets 11 entities and individuals, with Rubio accusing the Havana regime of sanctions, evasion, and exploiting overseas medical workers. So, quote, over the past century, programs like the Brigade have helped Cuba infiltrate And that line is the blade, because Marco Rubio names the regime, names the method, and then drive it straight through Barack Obama's sanitized origin story by tying Havana's subversion to the radicals who launched him in 1995, which means this was never harmless nostalgia about old revolutionaries. It was a communist conveyor belt into elite academia, NGOs, and the Democrat machine. So Marco Rubio needs to keep naming Barack Obama, Bill Ayers, Bernardine, Dohrn. No more fog, no more cute nostalgia about communist chick while Havana rigs infiltration, forced labor cash, border pressure, and intel games 90 miles off of Florida. Trump said Cuba is next. And I want you to hear that as strength, not drift. We watched fake tough guys appease this regime for years, and all they bought was more misery for Cubans and more cover for American radicals who treated Havana like a moral mascot. So drop your take below on how hard Trump should press. And send this to one person still repeating Mark Polkin's nothing bad happened nonsense. And keep your eyes on every Democrat who scrambles to defend this dictatorship when the screws tighten. You see, Trump's Cuba is next warning is exactly why our Inside Channel matters tonight. So text White House to 844-840-4963. Next News Network is credentialed inside the White House, and our nightly reports pulled straight from the building hit your phone ahead of the crowd, past YouTube's suppression games, and right where the gatekeepers can't touch them.